The note was simple, just 5 words scrawled in blue ink on a folded piece of paper. But as Mark stared at it, his coffee growing cold beside him, he felt something shift in his carefully constructed world. I'm alone. Can I join you? If you've ever felt that unexpected moment when life offers a second chance, this story might just touch your heart. Before we dive in, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe. Stories like these don't come along every day, and I promise this journey is worth every minute. Mark Sullivan hadn't planned on becoming a single father at 34. 3 years ago, his wife Eliza had kissed him goodbye one ordinary Tuesday morning, then died in a car accident that afternoon. Since then, he'd been raising their daughter Sophie alone, building routines around school drop-offs, weekend pancakes, and the quiet coffee shop where he worked remotely 3 mornings a week. The coffee shop had become his sanctuary, a place where he could breathe between responsibilities. He always sat at the same corner table, laptop open, headphones on, a silent signal to the world, I'm busy. I'm working. Please don't disturb me. Until today. Until the note. He looked up, scanning the half-empty cafe. His eyes landed on a woman sitting alone by the window. She wasn't looking at him, but at her hands, which were moving in what he now recognized as sign language. She was practicing, repeating the same gestures over and over. Mark hadn't used sign language since college, where he'd learned it for a linguistics requirement. But something made him fold the note carefully, walk across the room, and stop at her table. Hi, he said, then awkwardly signed the greeting. Her eyes widened with surprise, then relief. She signed back, her movements fluid and natural compared to his rusty attempts. I'm Rachel, she signed. Sorry for the note. I see you here all the time. I'm Mark, he replied, speaking and signing simultaneously, his hands remembering more than he expected. Would you like to join me? That first conversation was halting, with Mark struggling to remember signs and Rachel patiently helping him. She was deaf since birth, she explained, a graphic designer who had recently moved to town for a job. She'd been coming to the coffee shop hoping to meet people, but most were uncomfortable when they realized she couldn't hear. People see my deafness before they see me, she signed. Mark nodded. People see my single parenthood before they see me. Something connected between them in that moment, a recognition of what it meant to be defined by circumstances rather than choice. As weeks passed, their coffee meetings became a regular part of Mark's routine. His sign language improved, and Rachel began teaching Sophie basic signs during weekend park meetups. Sophie, with the adaptability of 7-year-olds, took to it immediately, delighted to have a secret language with her new friend. But Mark kept Rachel at a careful distance. Their friendship was comfortable, safe. He wasn't ready for more, wasn't sure he'd ever be ready again. Then came the school talent show disaster. Sophie had been practicing a dance routine for weeks, excited to perform on stage. Mark had recorded her rehearsals, helped make her costume, listened to the same pop song hundreds of times. But on the morning of the show, he received an emergency call from a client. A major project was falling apart, and he was the only one who could fix it. I'll be there, Sophie Bear, he promised as he dropped her at school. I just need to solve this problem first. But one problem led to another, and by the time he looked at his watch, he realized with horror that he'd missed half the show. He raced to the school, heart pounding, only to find Sophie's class already finished. She sat alone on a bench outside the auditorium, still in her sparkly costume, tears streaming down her face. You promised, she whispered, and Mark felt his heart break. No amount of apologizing could erase the hurt in her eyes. That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed still not speaking to him, Mark sat on his porch steps, head in his hands. His phone buzzed with a text from Rachel, their usual way of communicating outside the cafe. Everything okay? Missed you today. Before he could think better of it, Mark called her, something he'd never done before. When she answered with video, he signed clumsily through his explanation, his hands shaking with emotion. I failed her, he signed. Just like I failed Eliza. Rachel's face softened with compassion. How did you fail Eliza? She asked. The question caught him off guard. He'd never told anyone about his last conversation with his wife, about the argument they'd had that morning over something so trivial he couldn't even remember what started it. About how she'd left angry, how his last words to her had been spoken in frustration rather than love. But sitting there in the dark, he told Rachel everything. How he'd been working too much then too, how he'd promised Eliza he would change, how he never got the chance. I'm making the same mistakes, he signed. I'm losing what matters most. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. Then she signed, do you want my help? The next morning, Mark woke to a text from Rachel with a link to a video. It was Sophie's dance performance, recorded from the audience, slightly shaky but capturing every moment of his daughter's routine. Rachel had been there, sitting quietly in the back, recording for a friend she thought might miss it. Mark showed the video to Sophie over breakfast. Rachel was there, he explained. She saved your performance for us. Sophie's eyes widened. Can we watch it with her? That afternoon, the three of them sat on Mark's couch watching Sophie dance on the TV screen. When it ended, Sophie turned to Rachel. Will you teach me more signs? She asked. I want to tell you something important. Rachel nodded, and patiently helped Sophie form the signs for, thank you for being our friend. Mark watched them, something warm and forgotten unfurling in his chest. Later, when Sophie went to play in her room, he turned to Rachel. Why did you record it? He asked. You didn't know I would miss it. Rachel smiled. I know what it's like to miss things, she signed. To be left out. I didn't want either of you to feel that way. In that moment, Mark realized how much Rachel understood, not just about loss, but about finding ways to bridge the gaps that life creates. Summer arrived, bringing with it Sophie's school break and longer days. Mark adjusted his work schedule to spend more time with his daughter, and Rachel became a regular presence in their lives. She taught them both more sign language, joined their weekend adventures, and slowly, the walls Mark had built around his heart began to crumble. But as their relationship deepened, new challenges emerged. Mark's parents visited from Florida, bringing with them well-intentioned but uncomfortable questions about Rachel. She seems nice, his mother said carefully after meeting her, but don't you think Sophie needs someone who can hear her? Mark had been shocked by the comment, then angry. Rachel hears Sophie better than most people with perfect hearing, he'd replied. The incident forced him to confront his own lingering doubts. Was he ready to open his life, and Sophie's, to someone new? Someone whose experience of the world was so different from their own? His uncertainty created a distance between him and Rachel. Their easy companionship became strained with unspoken questions. Rachel sensed his withdrawal and gave him space, her texts becoming less frequent, their coffee meetings more formal. Sophie noticed the change immediately. Why isn't Rachel coming over anymore? She asked one evening as Mark tucked her into bed. Did she stop liking us? No, sweetheart, Mark said. Sometimes grown-ups need to figure things out. What things? Mark sighed. Sometimes we're afraid of changing things that are already good. Sophie considered this with the straightforward wisdom of children. But Daddy, you always tell me being brave means doing things even when they're scary. Her words stayed with him that night as he sat alone on the porch, looking at old text conversations with Rachel. He realized with sudden clarity that he wasn't just afraid of change, he was afraid of loss. Of loving someone and losing them again. The next morning, he went to the coffee shop at their usual time, but Rachel wasn't there. Nor the next day, or the day after. A week passed without any contact. Mark finally texted her, asking if they could meet, but received no response. It was Sophie who figured it out. Maybe she's sick, she suggested. We should bring her soup, like you do when I'm sick." The idea was so simple, so obvious, that Mark felt foolish for not thinking of it himself. That evening, they made chicken soup together and drove to Rachel's apartment. When she opened the door, her face pale and her eyes red-rimmed, Mark realized Sophie had been right. "We brought soup," he signed, feeling suddenly awkward. Rachel looked surprised, then touched. She invited them in, explaining through signs that she'd had a bad flu and her phone had died days ago. She hadn't had the energy to charge it. As Sophie proudly served the soup she'd helped make, Mark watched Rachel's face, the gentle way she thanked his daughter, the careful attention she paid to Sophie's still developing signs. He saw the woman who had recorded a school performance just in case, who taught them a new language, who understood what it meant to navigate a world not designed for you. And he realized he'd been asking the wrong questions all along. Not whether he was ready for change, but whether he was brave enough to embrace the connection they'd already built. Later, after Sophie had fallen asleep on Rachel's couch, Mark signed the words he'd been holding back. "I've been afraid," he admitted, "of what might happen if I let myself care too much about you." Rachel's eyes were gentle. "I know," she signed. "I've been afraid too." "Of what?" "That I could never be enough for you both. That my deafness would always be a barrier." Mark shook his head. "Your deafness isn't a barrier. My fear is." They talked late into the night, their hands moving in the dim light of Rachel's living room. About loss and loneliness, about the families they'd been born into and the ones they might choose to create. About Sophie, and what she needed, and what they both wanted. When Mark finally carried his sleeping daughter to the car, Rachel followed them out. Under the streetlight, he turned to her. "I'm alone," he signed, echoing her first note to him. "Can I join you?" Rachel's smile was like sunrise. "We're not alone anymore," she signed back. "Either of us." The months that followed weren't perfect. There were adjustments and misunderstandings, moments of frustration when communication failed them. Mark's parents needed time to understand the relationship. Rachel's colleagues sometimes made thoughtless comments about her, helping the poor single dad. Sophie occasionally struggled when classmates asked questions about her new mom who talks with her hands. But there were beautiful moments too. The first time Rachel stayed over, and Sophie found her making breakfast in the morning, and simply handed her the maple syrup without a word, as if Rachel had always been there. The afternoon Mark came home to find them both asleep on the couch, a sign language book open between them. The evening Rachel taught them both to dance without music, feeling the vibrations through the floor instead. On the anniversary of Eliza's death, Mark took Sophie to the cemetery as he did every year. This time, Rachel waited in the car, giving them privacy for their ritual. But as they walked back, Sophie suddenly ran ahead. "I want Rachel to meet Mom," she announced, taking Rachel's hand and pulling her toward the grave. Mark watched as his daughter proudly introduced Rachel, signing and speaking simultaneously the way they all did now. "This is Rachel," Sophie said to the headstone. "She makes us happy again." That night, after Sophie was asleep, Mark found Rachel on the porch swing, looking at the stars. "Thank you for today," he signed. "For understanding." Rachel took his hand. "Eliza will always be Sophie's mother," she signed. "And part of your heart." "Yes," Mark agreed. "But my heart has grown. There's room for new love too." 6 months later, on a crisp fall morning, Mark returned to the coffee shop where it had all begun. He sat at his usual table, but this time he wasn't alone. Sophie sat beside him, practicing her signs with growing confidence. And across from them sat Rachel, now wearing a simple engagement ring. The barista who had witnessed their first meeting brought over their usual orders, plus a cupcake with a candle. "What's this for?" Mark asked. 1 year ago today, the barista said, "She passed you that note." She nodded toward Rachel. "I remember because it was so romantic, watching you try to sign to each other." Like something from a movie. Mark translated for Rachel, who laughed and signed back, "Our movie is just beginning." As they shared the cupcake, Mark looked around the coffee shop, at the table where he'd sat alone for so long, at the window where Rachel had waited for connection, at his daughter who now moved effortlessly between two languages. He thought about the note that had changed everything, about the courage it had taken Rachel to reach across the silence. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is admit we're alone. And sometimes, the most beautiful response is simply, "Not anymore." That evening, as they walked home hand in hand, Sophie skipping ahead of them, Mark turned to Rachel. "I never asked you," he signed. "Why did you choose me? That day in the coffee shop. Why send the note to me?" Rachel's hands formed the words slowly, thoughtfully. "Because you looked like you were listening," she signed. "Even when you couldn't hear me." And in that moment, Mark understood that what had brought them together wasn't chance or convenience or even loneliness. It was recognition, of seeing and being seen, of hearing and being heard, in all the ways that truly matter. They had both been alone, until they weren't. And in finding each other, they had created something new, a family built not on perfect circumstances but on the perfect willingness to bridge whatever gaps might come. As Sophie ran back to them, taking both their hands and swinging between them, Mark knew with certainty that some stories don't end with happily ever after. The best ones begin there instead.